Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Thanksgiving always used to mean something in our house, even before Carter died, and even more after. Not the glossy, magazine cover kind of Thanksgiving, no gold-rimmed china or table arrangements that smelled more like a florist's showroom than a family dinner. No, ours was smaller, simpler, filled with laughter, mismatched plates, gravy stains on the tablecloth, and Jason running around with a paper turkey he made in school. But this year was different. This year, the air already felt heavier before the first leaf even fell. Maybe I should have trusted my gut right then. It started with an envelope, one of those ivory-colored ones with embossed edges, like a wedding invitation or some fundraiser for bored rich women who sip mimosas at 10 in the morning. It came 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, hand-delivered by a driver who didn't say a word, just nodded and left. Inside was a single piece of thick paper, the kind that makes a paper cut feel like a lawsuit. The Whitmore family formally invites you and your son, Jason, to Thanksgiving dinner at Whitmore Estate. Formal attire requested. No warm words. No, we'd love to see you. Not even a damn RSVP line. Just cold formality that felt like it belonged more to a courtroom summons than a family gathering. I stood in the kitchen reading it twice, maybe 3 times, while the kettle whistled behind me and Jason built Lego towers on the living room floor. I didn't know what to make of it. Not exactly a peace offering. Not exactly a threat. Just something in between. It was Helen's way. Always polished on the outside, venomous underneath. After Carter's funeral, she barely looked me in the eye, except when she thought I wasn't grieving the right way. Not enough tears, not the right outfit, not enough of a performance for her gilded standards. And yet, here she was, months later, extending this invitation like a queen throwing scraps to a stray dog. Jason, of course, was excited. He didn't see the strings behind the gesture. He missed the mansion, the winding staircase, the koi pond, the velvet drapes that looked like something out of a royal theater. And he missed Helen, too, in his own innocent way. He didn't know how cruel people could be behind gentle smiles and sugar-coated voices. He just remembered her offering him candy once, or letting him play in the garden maze while she sipped tea with her nose in the clouds. "Can we go, Mom?" he asked, eyes wide, clutching the invitation like it was made of gold. I hesitated. I really did. My instinct screamed no. But then I looked at him, hopeful, bright, craving some piece of the family he'd lost with his father. And I swallowed every alarm bell ringing inside me. "Sure," I said. "We'll go." I spent the next days pretending I was fine with it. Picked out a dress, ironed Jason's little suit, tried to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, I was overthinking. Maybe Helen was trying to mend fences. Maybe the icy civility was just her version of an olive branch. People change, right? Grief softens sharp edges, doesn't it? But something didn't sit right. Sophie, my best friend since high school, didn't help. "You really gonna let that frosty witch pull you into her little palace of pretension?" she asked, biting into a bagel like it owed her money. "She didn't ask you to dinner, Em. She's baiting you." "I know," I said, staring into my coffee. "But Jason wants to go. And I can't deny him that." She shook her head, muttering something under her breath that included the word bourgeois hyena. I laughed, but there was a pit in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Still, I didn't cancel. I didn't call Helen. I didn't say no. The morning of Thanksgiving, I woke up early, even though I hadn't slept much. Jason was already up, nervous in the mirror, adjusting his tie, asking if he looked okay. He looked like Carter. God, he looked so much like him it hurt to breathe for a moment. I kissed his forehead and told him he looked perfect. He did. We arrived at the mansion around 4. The air was cold, the kind that bites through your coat even if the sun's still out. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, the usual rich people parade. A valet took our car like we were hotel guests, and the butler, yes, a goddamn butler, opened the door with a blank expression that said this was just another chore. We walked into a house that smelled like roasted duck and money. Helen greeted us in a gown that probably cost more than our monthly rent. Her lips curled into something that might have been called a smile if you'd never seen a real one before. "Emily," she said, her voice silk-wrapped poison. "Jason, how nice of you to join us." I nodded politely. Jason said, "Hello, Grandma," and she nodded back like he was a waiter offering her a refill. We walked into the dining room, long and polished, lit by chandeliers that dripped crystal like icicles. The table was set perfectly, dozens of plates, name cards, tall glasses, gold-accented everything. But something hit me then, like a slap wrapped in velvet. There were 15 chairs. 14 with proper place settings, china, cutlery, folded napkins, wine glasses. One with none of that. One seat at the far end, smaller than the others, with a metal bowl sitting on the table. A dog bowl. And inside it, dry dog food. Jason paused. I paused. My heart cracked in real time. And Helen? Helen stood behind us, smirking. Like she'd just won something. Like this was funny. Like this wasn't a fucking child standing there, blinking back tears. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I just reached for Jason's hand, held it tight, and we walked out the way we came in. No words. No scene. Just silence. Heavy, cutting, louder than anything I could have shouted. And as the door shut behind us, I heard the faintest sound, Helen's soft, satisfied chuckle. What harm could a dinner do? I thought. I hadn't seen the dog bowl yet. The thing about walking into a place that reeks of money and power is that you feel it before you even smell it. It hangs in the air, heavy like humidity before a storm, choking the warmth right out of your lungs. The chandelier above the table looked like it belonged in a royal opera house, with crystal droplets catching the light in all directions, casting shimmering ghosts across the walls. The table itself stretched like a damn runway, polished so clean you could see your reflection warping in the mahogany. Every inch of that room screamed opulence. High-backed velvet chairs, gold-edged charger plates, and silverware so shiny it looked untouched by actual human hands. But no amount of decoration could cover up the stench of what was about to unfold. Jason stepped in behind me, his little hands adjusting the cuffs of his blazer like he'd seen his father do 100 times. He looked proud just to be there, and it broke me inside because he didn't yet understand how little that pride meant to people like Helen. He still believed this place was part of his identity, still thought these walls held some kind of welcome for him, that his father's blood was enough to claim his place at this table. He didn't know that to people like Helen, blood only mattered when it ran through the right veins, the clean, rich, legacy veins, not the ones she deemed contaminated by slums, by single motherhood, by grief that didn't wear pearls. The guests were already seated, a parade of uptight cousins and distant relatives who probably practiced their smiles in mirrors. Conversations floated around the room, shallow and brittle, like everyone was just waiting for the food so they could stop pretending to care about each other's lives. No one stood when we entered, no warm hellos, no gestures to come closer, just a few side glances and tight-lipped nods, like we were the latecomers to a meeting we were never invited to in the first place. And then I saw it. At the far end of the table, where the lighting dipped into soft gold, was a small, narrow chair, shorter than the rest, almost like a kid's chair you'd find at a daycare. In front of it sat a metal bowl. Not a soup bowl. Not some eccentric designer dish. A literal stainless steel dog bowl. And inside it, dry, brown kibble. Actual dog food. No cutlery, no plate, no napkin, not even a damn water glass. Just that bowl. Sitting there like an accusation, like a joke, like a punchline to some cruel joke only Helen found funny. I froze in place, my brain scrambling to process what I was seeing. Jason was still walking forward, cheerful, until he noticed the stairs. His steps slowed, his smile faltered, and then his eyes landed on that damn bowl. He stopped dead. His hands twitched at his sides, and for a second, I saw his lips tighten like he was trying not to cry. And then I saw her, Helen, standing just behind her seat, that smug little smirk painted across her perfectly powdered face like it was the height of decorum. "Is there a mistake?" I asked, my voice low, steady, dangerous. Not a yell, not a scream, just a calm whisper sharpened to a razor's edge. Helen tilted her head slightly, as if genuinely puzzled, then said with the kind of cold elegance that made my skin crawl, "Oh, I thought it was fitting. A child from the slums doesn't deserve a proper meal, don't you agree?" Her voice was like silk soaked in venom, smooth and poisonous all at once. The room went still. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. No one said a word. Not a damn one of them had the spine to object, to defend Jason, to speak up against her cruelty. Just silence. Deafening, suffocating, complicit silence. Jason's eyes filled, but he didn't let a single tear fall. He stood straight, jaw clenched, trying so hard to hold it in, to be brave. And that, more than anything else, shattered me inside. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He just looked at me, silently asking what to do, trusting me to guide him through a moment no child should ever have to endure. I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything, even though my hands were shaking with rage. I didn't deliver some grand speech or demand apologies from people who didn't deserve our breath. I just reached for his hand, squeezed it tight, and we turned. Walked away. Just like that. Not a single word. Not a glance back. Because some battles aren't worth fighting when you already know the battlefield is rigged. Some wars you win not by drawing blood, but by denying the enemy your dignity. As we stepped outside into the bitter evening air, I could still feel Helen's smirk burning on the back of my neck like a scar I hadn't earned. Jason didn't say much in the car. He just stared out the window, quiet, blinking too often to hide the tears. I wanted to wrap the world around him like armor, shield him from everything vile and cold and cruel. But all I had in that moment was silence. The kind that cuts deeper than any insult, the kind that says more than any scream. And still, all the way home, I kept asking myself the same damn thing. What would you have done in that moment? Would you scream? Flip the table? Or walk out with your dignity? I still ask myself, did I do the right thing? I didn't say a word to Helen. But silence, when it's sharp enough, leaves a wound that never really heals. Helen's smug look was the last thing I saw before the door closed behind us. But karma has good vision. And she doesn't knock. She breaks down the door. The car ride home was the kind of silence that didn't soothe, didn't calm, didn't even allow thoughts to settle. It was a silence filled with everything we didn't say, everything we couldn't say, everything we didn't yet know how to scream. Jason sat in the back seat, his small hands clenched into tight fists on his lap, eyes staring blankly through the window as if the world outside could explain what had just happened inside that cold, golden prison of a dining room. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, hoping for a flicker of a smile, a question, anything to show he hadn't folded inward. But he didn't speak. He didn't move. He just sat there, still and quiet, the way children sometimes do when they don't know how to carry the weight adults have thrown on their tiny shoulders. When we got home, he walked straight to his room without a word, without taking off his shoes or jacket, and I followed him a few minutes later just to hear the sound of him breathing. That's when I heard it, a single choked sob, muffled beneath the blanket he had pulled over his head like it could hide him from the shame he didn't deserve to feel. And then another sob. And another. Until his body started shaking beneath the covers, and my heart broke in a way I didn't think hearts could break anymore. I sat on the edge of his bed, placing a hand gently on his back, not speaking, not comforting him with meaningless words like, "It's going to be okay," or, "She didn't mean it," because I wasn't about to lie to my son just to ease my own guilt. I let him cry. I let him feel it, because pretending everything was fine would have been another kind of cruelty. And when he finally looked up at me, his face blotchy and red, his voice came out so small it almost didn't sound like him. "Why did she hate me so much, Mom? What did I do wrong?" And I swear to God, I wanted to burn the whole damn estate to the ground right then and there. But I didn't let that rage escape my lips. I just looked at him, brushed the hair from his forehead, and said, "You didn't do anything wrong, baby. You just exist." And that's enough to threaten people who've built their whole world on pretending they're better than the rest of us. After he fell asleep, I sat in the kitchen for hours, staring at nothing, drinking coffee that tasted like regret, and planning things I wasn't yet ready to speak out loud. I wasn't going to let this go, not because of pride, but because my son needed to see that dignity isn't the same as submission. He needed to know that being silent at that table didn't mean we accepted the humiliation, it just meant we were preparing a different kind of answer. The next morning, Sophie stormed into my house like a one-woman army, her face already loaded with fury before she even opened her mouth. She didn't knock. She never did. She just walked in, tossed her coat onto the chair, and said, "All right, you tell me where this bitch lives, and I'll make sure her silverware ends up somewhere the sun doesn't shine." I couldn't help but laugh, even if it was bitter and short. I already know where she lives, sophomore. That's not the hard part. She looked at me, narrowed her eyes, and sat across from me with that familiar fire I'd leaned on 1,000 times. Then what is? I want to hit her where it hurts, I said. Not her face, not her pride. I want to take apart everything she built brick by brick and make her watch it fall. Sophie grinned, all teeth and approval. That's my girl. But something in me still needed more than just vengeance. I needed clarity. I needed a plan, not rage. So later that night, when Jason was asleep again and the house was wrapped in a strange kind of peace, I started digging. Not metaphorically. I literally went into the attic and pulled out the heavy old boxes that had been gathering dust since Carter died. Boxes I hadn't been able to look through. Boxes full of his papers, letters, journals, memories that had once hurt too much to touch. And then I found it. A thick envelope, sealed and marked in Carter's handwriting, personal legal documents. I hadn't seen it before. Or maybe I had and just didn't have the strength to open it back when grief was still bleeding out of me. But now my fingers didn't shake. My hands were steady, my breathing calm, my heart heavy but ready. I tore open the envelope carefully, and there it was, his will. Still untouched. Still unread. Still full of possibilities. I sat at the kitchen table and started reading, flipping through page after page of lawyer speak and estate terms and clauses I barely understood. But then I saw something that made my breath hitch, something I had never known, something that Helen sure as hell never wanted me to know. A clause, tucked in toward the end, one that Carter must have added quietly, maybe even secretly, before he died. A clause about Jason, a clause about the inheritance. A clause about control. And suddenly everything made sense. Helen's constant disdain, her desperation to undermine us, her need to keep us beneath her heel. Because if what I found in that envelope is real, if this clause holds legal ground, then Helen's entire life is about to change. And she won't see it coming. The morning after Thanksgiving arrived like a slow-moving bruise, dull at first, then throbbing beneath the skin, a persistent ache that didn't quite let you forget what had been done. The house was quiet in that strange, post-holiday way, but this silence wasn't peace. It was tension stretched tight, like the last thread before something snaps. I sat at the kitchen table with Carter's will laid out in front of me, the pages splayed like a map to a future Helen never wanted us to find. I hadn't slept much, but sleep didn't matter anymore. What I had in my hands was bigger than rest, bigger than revenge. It was leverage, power, and, most of all, justice. Jason had finally managed a smile over breakfast, a real one, the kind that wasn't forced or shadowed by shame. I didn't tell him everything yet. He was still too young to understand how deeply adults could bury their cruelty behind polished words and inherited wealth, but I promised him that things were going to change, and this time, I meant it in a way I hadn't before. I kissed his forehead, sent him off to watch cartoons, and waited. I didn't know when she'd come, but I knew she would. Someone like Helen doesn't sit still when their kingdom is shaking. It was around 11 when the doorbell rang once, sharply, like a demand trying to masquerade as a request. I took my time opening the door, because some moments deserve to breathe before you let them unfold. And there she was, Helen Whitmore, standing on my porch like a relic out of place, her usual perfection cracked at the edges. Her lipstick was smudged, her pearl earrings mismatched, her hair pulled back in a bun that looked like she'd twisted it in haste. For the first time, she looked less like royalty and more like a woman losing control. "Emily," she said, her voice trying hard to stay even, but I heard the tremor tucked beneath the surface like a splinter. "We need to talk." I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, not inviting her in. "Do we?" She exhaled, eyes flicking toward the hallway behind me like she was trying to locate Jason without asking. "About yesterday. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a poorly planned joke." I'm not sure what happened, but I stopped her with a single look, the kind that cuts sharper than any word. "You planned that humiliation down to the goddamn dog bowl, Helen. Don't stand here pretending you tripped and fell into cruelty." Her face twitched, just slightly, like she wasn't used to being spoken to like an equal, let alone an opponent. "I think emotions were high, and perhaps we should discuss this calmly. For Jason's sake." That's when I smiled, but not the kind she'd expect. Not polite. Not warm. The kind of smile that says, "I've already won, and you just don't know it yet." I opened the door wider, not out of kindness, but because I wanted her to see the folder sitting on my kitchen table. Her eyes landed on it like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. "Do you know what Carter left behind, Helen?" I asked, stepping aside so she could follow me in. "Do you know what's in that envelope you pretended never existed?" She said nothing, but I saw her throat tighten as she walked toward the table. I picked up the will, holding it like a weapon made of paper and truth. There's a clause deep in the fine print. A trust tied to Jason. Carter must have added it just months before he died. It says this estate, your precious Whitmore legacy, passes entirely to Jason when he turns 18. But here's the best part. There's a morality clause. If anyone in the family treats him with willful cruelty, if there's evidence of humiliation or abuse, the trust activates early. Which means, Helen, if I show this clause to the estate lawyer, if I show him proof of what you did, you lose everything. Control of the house. Voting rights in the board. You're standing. All of it. She tried to laugh, but it came out thin and brittle. You have no proof. It's just your word. I walked to the counter, reached for my purse, and pulled out a small device. It wasn't fancy, just a discreet little body cam with a hidden lens, one-eyed clipped inside my bag out of instinct, out of habit, out of knowing the kind of woman I was dealing with. I pressed play, and her voice filled the room like poison in water. "A child from the slums doesn't deserve a proper meal." There it was. Crystal clear. Her voice, her words, her cruelty. She went pale, her mouth opening slightly before she caught herself. "You recorded me?" "No," I said. "I recorded everything." She staggered back slightly, and I could see it now, the realization dawning, the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crack. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, Helen looked small. Not physically, but emotionally, like someone had taken her crown, snapped it in half, and left her standing in the rubble. "You don't get to hurt him and walk away untouched," I said, my voice low, deliberate, final. "You wanted to play games, Helen. But you never learned the first rule, never underestimate the quiet ones." She didn't say another word. She turned and walked out of the house with stiff steps, the door clicking shut behind her like the closing of a casket on her reign. She didn't know I installed that camera in my purse. But she knows now. And this game has only just begun. There's a particular silence that comes before a storm, and then there's the silence that comes after a reckoning, a silence so loud it echoes through corridors where power once whispered confidently and now only shame lingers in its place. Helen didn't return my calls after that day, not that I expected her to, but I knew something was brewing behind those gilded doors she'd tried so hard to keep shut against people like me. I could feel the tremble in her world, and I didn't need to raise my voice to shake her foundations, because when truth finally walks in, even the grandest lies crumble like rotted wood under pressure. It didn't take long for word to reach the family board, those crusty, entitled men in their tailored suits who prided themselves on legacy and tradition, who nodded slowly during meetings and spoke in low, weighty tones like their opinions were carved into the very bones of the family business. Carter had sat among them once, the only one of them who ever looked at people like they mattered more than the numbers on paper. And now, Through a twist of irony so sharp it could draw blood, I was walking through those same doors with Carter's will in hand and Jason's name inked across their legacy like a verdict none of them could undo. The meeting was called within the week, and Helen was summoned, no longer with her usual grace and arrogance, but with the undercurrent of desperation that clung to her like a perfume gone sour. I arrived deliberately late, not to be rude, but to let the tension build the way a good story does when the villain starts to sweat. The room smelled of oak and old money, and every eye turned when I entered, not with hostility, not even curiosity, but something new, something uncertain, like they knew the power had shifted and didn't yet know how to behave around it. Helen sat stiffly at the end of the table, her hands folded tightly, her expression trying to hold dignity together like a crumbling dam. I placed the documents on the polished surface without a word, letting them speak louder than I ever could. The clause was read aloud, each syllable delivered like a gavel strike, and the board members looked at one another with widening eyes and forced coughs, clearly shaken by what it all meant. Jason's trust was now not only legally untouchable, it came with conditions that gave me, as his legal guardian and trustee, voting rights within the family's core holdings. And as for Helen, her control, her influence, her iron grip on the house and its legacy was formally, thoroughly, and irrevocably removed. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't clap or cheer or raise my glass in victory. I just thanked them for their time, stood quietly, and walked out, because sometimes the most satisfying revenge is found in composure, in dignity, in letting your silence be the loudest noise in the room. But I wasn't finished. No, not yet. 2 weeks later, I sent out invitations, real ones this time, handwritten, warm, personal. I invited everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or sneered at by Helen's cold rain. Former staff, distant relatives without titles, even the neighbor who once said she felt uncomfortable walking into that house. I threw a dinner party at the same mansion, in the same dining room where Jason had once been served humiliation on a silver tray. But this time, the air was different, lighter, warmer, filled with laughter and clinking glasses and stories that didn't start with wealth and end with judgment. The chandeliers still sparkled, the table was still long, but it no longer felt like a throne room. It felt like a home, and every seat was a seat of honor. Jason ran around freely, giggling with other kids, the same boy who had once sat silently beneath the weight of a dog bowl now shining like the center of everything this family should have stood for. People smiled for real. Conversations flowed without scripts. Even the food tasted better, like it had been waiting for years to finally be enjoyed by people who appreciated more than just presentation. And then she arrived, late, of course, as if clinging to old habits, hoping her entrance would still cause a ripple. But it didn't. People barely glanced in her direction. She hovered in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside slowly, like a ghost unsure whether it belonged among the living. I didn't stop the music. I didn't announce her arrival. I simply walked over, greeted her with a polite nod, and handed her a small plate. She looked down, and there it was, a pristine, silver-plated dog bowl. But inside wasn't kibble or cruelty. It was dessert. A delicate crème brûlée, perfectly caramelized, garnished with fresh berries and a hint of lemon zest. Elegant. Intentional. Beautiful. She stared at it for a long time, her face unreadable, her pride caught in her throat like a bone she couldn't swallow. And I said nothing. Not a single word. I just turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with the symbol of her own downfall cradled in her perfectly manicured hands. I didn't need to humiliate her to win. I didn't need to push her down to rise. I just needed to remind her quietly, clearly, and irrevocably that the empire she once ruled with ice was now a place where warmth lived, and she no longer had a seat at the table. Because sometimes the most devastating checkmate isn't made with thunder, it's made with a whisper, a smile, and a single, unforgettable gesture that says, "I could have destroyed you, but I chose not to." And that's what will haunt her longer than anything else. There's a certain kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from resolution, a silence that no longer feels heavy or suffocating, but strangely weightless, like the final exhale after a long, brutal climb. In the weeks that followed the dinner party, life didn't change in some dramatic cinematic way. There were no grand celebrations or confetti falling from the sky, but something shifted, subtle yet undeniable, like the house had finally stopped holding its breath. Jason smiled more often, and when he did, it wasn't the kind of smile he wore to mask pain or confusion. It was something honest, something whole, something that felt like childhood returning in slow, cautious steps. He had started sleeping with the door slightly open again, a small detail only a mother would notice, but one that told me more than any words ever could. He didn't flinch at sudden noises, didn't avoid looking at himself in the mirror, didn't ask questions about Helen anymore. Whatever wounds had been inflicted in that dining room, those small, sharp humiliations carved into a boy's dignity, they had begun to heal, not because time passed, but because I had finally given him the truth he'd been craving without even realizing it. He had seen me stand tall, not just in anger, but in strength, in quiet certainty, and maybe that was the armor he'd needed more than anything else. As for Helen, her retreat was as dramatic in its absence as her presence had once been suffocating. She disappeared from the family gatherings, stopped attending board meetings, vanished from society columns that once fawned over her taste and her lineage like she was royalty reincarnated. No official statements were made, no scandals splashed across headlines, just a slow, silent erosion of power that no one dared mention aloud. I heard whispers, of course, rumors that she had moved to the old lake house upstate, that she rarely answered calls, that her closest friends had begun politely distancing themselves in the way people do when they sense a sinking ship and want to keep their shoes dry. But I didn't pursue any of it. I didn't care to know what her days looked like now, didn't need to hear about her solitude or her regrets. I had said all I needed to say with that bowl of creme brulee and the look in her eyes when I handed it over. Still, even as peace settled into our lives like soft dust, I found myself wondering, more than I liked to admit, whether the revenge had truly satisfied me, or if it had simply distracted me from deeper grief I hadn't yet confronted. There were nights, long after Jason had gone to bed and the house had gone still, when I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and let my mind wander to the beginning of it all. To Carter. To the way his death had left me not just alone, but exposed, like grief had peeled back every layer of skin and left me raw to the world's cruelty. I missed him, in ways I couldn't always explain. Not just the man he was, but the calm he brought to chaos, the way he would have handled all of this with a half smile and a clever solution I'd never have thought of. Sometimes I'd catch myself imagining what he would have said if he'd seen what Helen did to our son, if he'd known how his mother's pride had twisted into something so damn ugly. Other times, I wondered if he'd left that clause in the will because he knew exactly what she was capable of, or worse, because he had seen it before and never dared to face it head-on. I kept the dog bowl. Not on display, not out of bitterness or cruelty, but tucked away in a drawer, beneath some old photo albums and forgotten paperwork. I didn't keep it as a trophy, I kept it as a reminder. A reminder of what silence can cost and what it can save. A reminder that sometimes the battles we fight aren't just for the people we love, but for the versions of ourselves we refuse to bury beneath someone else's judgment. Then, one afternoon, just as spring began nudging the frost off the garden beds, a small envelope arrived. No return address, no handwriting I recognized, just plain beige paper tucked quietly into the mailbox. I opened it carefully, expecting perhaps another dry legal form or a delayed invitation from someone I'd forgotten to care about. But inside was only a photo, old, faded, edges curled with time. It was Carter, a boy no older than Jason, sitting in the same dining room where it all began, dressed neatly, eyes wide, hair combed. And next to him, unmistakable and unmissable, was a dog bowl. The same kind, the same shape, the same damn bowl. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I meant to, as the weight of that image sank into my bones. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and understanding, between fury and sorrow. It was like someone had whispered a secret too late, a truth buried too deep and brought to light only when the damage was already done. Maybe that dog bowl had been more than just Helen's cruelty. It had been a cycle, a pattern, a wound passed down from generation to generation, dressed in silver and served on a tray. I folded the photo gently, placed it in the same drawer where the bowl now lived, and closed it slowly, letting the silence settle once more around me. Turns out, some stories go deeper than we ever dared to dig, and some scars don't start with us.